for Head Start, which was housed in Brewster.
Can you guys hear me? Wave your hands.
Okay.
Oh, no, he's talking.
I guess he's talking to Zoom people.
Because sometimes I don't know.
Why don't you guys close the door over there? Thanks.
Do you want that one shut too? Or not?
Yeah.
You got doors everywhere. in this one.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Well, good morning.
Good
Morning.
Good morning.
I am so happy to be here doing this. This ministry, this focus is extremely important to me, not only because I've been doing this for 18 years, but I also think that it is the best kept secret in ministry is ministry to older adults, especially older adults that are struggling with aging and Alzheimer's, dementia-related concerns. I don't think I need to persuade anyone that there's a lot of it going around out there in your congregations, right?
Absolutely.
So what I'm going to do today, I'm Howard West. I've been working with Country Meadows for 18 years. A little bit about my background. I've had different incarnations, but I was a therapist and counselor for 10 years before I went to seminary with Crystal. We were classmates at Princeton and entered the ministry. And I've mainly been doing pastoral care chaplaincy ministry during my tenure coming up on 20 years. But let me go through the presentation here today. There we go. And what are we going to talk about in the seminar today? I've got a lot of material. So I'm going to go pretty quickly, hopefully have enough time for the end. This may seem like a lot of psychology and geriatric stuff, and it is. But I wanted to say this, a little bit, I have to act like a minister too, right? Not just a counselor. Crystal gave me the scripture from John's gospel where Jesus tells Peter to feed my sheep, right? And if you look at that chapter before that, it's a very strange resurrection appearance where they're out fishing, they're not catching anything, and then Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, appears on the shore and then gives them instructions about how to fish properly. They get a lot of fish, and then in the next scene, he has a fire and he has grilled some fish, and they're eating on the shoreline. Right now, what do you think is interesting about that text? It's very earthy. It's very down to earth, right? It's not in a temple. It's not a religious speech or a sermon. It's basically Jesus by the campfire on the shore. And one of the things I like about the context of that scripture, which relates to my talk today, is that it was very physical. It was very practical. Jesus was there not only just to give some ethereal speech about theology, but he was showing them how to catch fish. He was making sure they had something to eat. And I think a lot of our ministry, especially as deacons and people in the church, we sometimes forget that it's the day in and day out practical tasks of living life together where we have our greatest ministry opportunities, just not in a pulpit or at a church service or something religious. I'm not minimizing that. And I think that that's where deacons and church members have their greatest ministry opportunities, is to connect with people physically, socially, especially people that that term they call it shut-ins. I kind of, I hate that term. People that maybe aren't coming out to church because of physical or cognitive issues. So here's what we're going to look at today. Okay, the first thing we're going to look at, if I can get this thing to move, is some basic facts about aging, dementia, Alzheimer's in the U.S. I think we need to provide a context of how big this problem is in America. And then I have, you're probably all familiar with the phrase, the elephant in the living room, big issues we don't talk about. And what I found in my career is that there's two huge elephants in the living room when we're dealing with older adults. One is grief and loss that's associated with aging. And the second is the caregiver's need for self-care. I started a grief support group at the Hershey Senior Center about a year ago. And one of the things that we were talking about yesterday was the superstitious statement that when somebody dies, their partner dies shortly after. You heard that, which is actually quite common. And we discussed about why that was, and then there's the broken heart theory, that their heart was broken. But I think a lot of it, and I've known this in my work, is the caregivers that are spending a lot of time caregiving for the other partner, okay, aren't taking care of themselves, and they are at a very high risk of having medical and other health issues because they haven't been taking care of themselves and at a higher risk of dying after the other partner dies. And then the third part I'm going to talk about is a pastoral perspective on loss, grief, and caregivers. Okay, it's great to talk psychology, but how are you going to relate this to actual ministry and what you're doing in your congregation? So it can be confusing when you're dealing with people in your congregation and family with aging related brain issues. We have here's another elephant, the metaphor of blind men feeling an elephant. And when you're dealing with age-related challenges, what are we dealing with? Is it a stroke? Is it CHF, right? Congestive heart failure? Is it depression? Are we dealing with Alzheimer's disease? Or is the person struggling with a UTI? I mean, a very common phenomenon for older adults is they can develop dementia-related symptoms when they have an infection, pneumonia, and UTI. And then what about Parkinson's? And the truth is that for many older adults, it's not just one thing, it's usually multiple things that are going on. So we'll talk about these two elephants in the living room and how we're dealing with that. Okay. So these are some basic terms that are associated with aging and mental decline. MCI, mild cognitive impairment. 50% of people at age 85 have some type of cognitive impairment, and that number goes up every year as they get older. Mild cognitive impairment usually is short-term memory loss, confusion, trouble understanding things and communicating. And then we can get into Alzheimer's disease, which is a distinct illness. Then of course there's vascular dementia, which is quite common. Sometimes I think we're seeing that's happening with younger people in their late 60s and 70s even. Lewy body, that's the illness that Robin Williams had. It's a horrible form of dementia, and it can include hallucinations and all types of depression. Frontal temporal, like there's a type of frontal lobe dementia. That's the front part of the brain that controls focus, coordination, shifting gears. That's quite common, frontal lobe dementia. And then Parkinson's disease, hippocampal sclerosis. So there's a whole bunch of different things that go on with the brain as people age. Some of it's hereditary, some of it's environmental. Okay, let's look at some statistics. About 2/3 of Americans with Alzheimer's are women. That's mainly because women live longer than men, right? And it's mainly due to them living longer, but we're seeing more rates of male dementia as men live longer too. Most women in the US are outliving their spouses. So what does that do? It places a burden on adult children. That's a word that you're going to hear me talk about here. Adult children, right? The adult children that are caring for the aging parent. Those are people that you might not think about in your congregations that are coming, right? And we've talked about the sandwich generation. You familiar with that term, where some folks in their middle age are caring for older adults and they're trying to help their kids grow up. They've got 20-somethings living at home, and then their parents are trying to take care of. The numbers are a little old, but it was the 7th leading cause of death from 2020 to 21, but it's still a major cause of death. And people over 65, this is important. People over 65 with Alzheimer's survive an average of 4 to 8 years. So if you're dealing with Alzheimer's, this is not a short-term thing. It can last quite a while. And some people have even lived 20 years since the time of their diagnosis. And this is one of the big things for caregivers and family members is so hard. This process can take a very long time and it's very unpredictable. It has a huge economic cost and psychological burden on individuals and families. How about Pennsylvania? Here's some statistics from Pennsylvania. There's probably, these numbers are a bit old. We have probably 300,000 people age 65 and older that are living with Alzheimer's in Pennsylvania. That's a big number, okay? About 10% of people 45 and older have some type of cognitive decline. Now that number may even be a little bit higher because one of the things that's happening right now in my field is we're having more and more trouble placing people into skilled nursing care facilities because we're having more younger people that are having brain damage related to drug overdoses and drug related abuse, okay? And this is important. And this number is probably closer to 500,000 family caregivers are bearing the burden of this illness in Pennsylvania. And that's just statistics on Alzheimer's. So again, you're going to learn things today, but more important than facts and figures is I hope that today you're going to have a greater awareness of how big and important this problem is. And it's right in your churches. Are you looking at it? Are you dealing with it? People need help. Okay. 642 million hours of unpaid care of people that are providing care for loved ones at home. Think about that. And you may think about this. Why isn't so-and-so coming to church? Why haven't we seen them? Have you ever thought, well, maybe they have to take care of their mother or their father or someone in their family and their caregiving responsibilities. Now, granted, with Zoom, it's easier for people to attend church on Zoom, but something to think about. And this ends up being about $10 billion of unpaid care just in Pennsylvania. So studies have shown that if you get on top of Alzheimer's and dementia sooner than later, the odds of dealing with it more effectively improve. So it's definitely something that it's good to talk about, and you can encourage people, we'll talk about this later, to educate themselves about dealing with it. Now, this first elephant in the living room I want to talk about is grief and loss. When I started 18 years ago, I did not even think about this topic. But over time, initially, I focused more on depression and stress. And then I began to realize as I did some continuing education and I did groups that a lot of people were just grieving. They're just grieving when they're dealing with aging adults in the family and caregiving, right? And this is from an anonymous caregiver, someone I work with. I never realized how many losses I've experienced and continue to experience as I deal with a loved one who's declining from age-related illnesses. There's so much grief, and it's so hard to find people who understand the losses and validate my grief. This is another call to ministry for you folks. That last part, there's so much grief, and it's so hard to find people who understand my losses. And Crystal talked about compassion when she was opening up. A lot of these issues we're dealing with can't be fixed, but you can witness the suffering of people and encourage and support them through the process. Okay, I'm going to try to whip through here a little faster. So who are we talking about? Talking about aging members of your congregation, homebound members, congregants maybe living in facilities. I don't know how much you've thought about that, but I see that with my work. A lot of folks, when they move into a care facility, churches basically forget who they are. All right? Now think about that. This is very few churches I've seen in my career have people to come and visit former parishioners in care facilities. And now, if there's dementia and Alzheimer's, folks may not remember, but for people who do remember, many of them feel abandoned and almost betrayed that I gave 50 years to that church, and now here I am, and nobody even remembers who I am anymore. Another ministry opportunity, okay? And just showing up and talking is enough. You don't have to do anything special, just to remember the person. Again, adult children of people dealing with aging, caregivers, spouses, family, friends of loved ones that are dealing with it. So you may have people in your congregation who have a friend with dementia or an aging related illness that doesn't have family, and they're providing some type of caregiving or support. That's another group we want to look at. And then in church congregations with clergy, elders, and deacons and other volunteers who can support the aging community. You know, a lot of churches will talk about ministries. How many have a ministry for the aging community, right? Not just at your own church. Now, I've ended up doing this grief support group at the Leader Center for Active Aging in Hershey. They do have a grief share. You've heard of grief share? That's a popular, a lot of churches. They have one over at Derry Presbyterian, but I've been doing this group at the Leader Center because there's a lot of people who don't go to church, who aren't affiliated with a congregation, that are struggling with grief. So if you can start some type of grief support issue, a group at your church, it might actually be a really great way to get people to come to your church and get to know people in the community. So I'm going to run through this quickly. I always have too much information. When we talk about age-related losses, there's really two layers. You know, the analogy of the peeling the layers of an onion. On the outer layer, or well, depending on how you do it, they're primary losses, physical losses due to injury, illness. People lose their role in family or society as they age. People lose spouses and relationships, long-term friends, or the loss of one's own life, the life as they know it. These are primary losses that everyone has. But what we often forget is there's secondary losses that occur as a result of that. Okay, big one, loss of independence, right? We forget. Now, we have a joke at where I work, that the two biggest challenges, the biggest challenge, and I see this in my support groups, is when you take someone's driver license away, right? Well, why is that?
Because their freedom's gone.
It's independence, right? And it also relates to a person's identity and their ability to have an independent life economically. And the other big one is we have happy hour at our facilities where people can have a drink. And what you're really seeing here is the reverse of growing up. When kids are growing up, what do they want? They want a driver's license and they want to be able to drink a beer, right? And then when we go back in the aging process, we see that. So a lot of these losses have deep symbolic meaning that affect the person's self-esteem and the way they look at themselves. And we sometimes forget that. A change in one's appearance. Isolation is huge. I mean, one of the things that we talk about in support groups and groups that I do is it was always hard to make friends. It didn't get any easier when I got old, right? And you lose friends through death, or they move away, or maybe friends develop medical problems. So that's another secondary loss that people are dealing with. Now, David Kessler is one of my favorite writers. As I said, I have a bibliography, and his book, Finding Meaning, The Sixth Stage of Grief, is a really good book. And here's some quotes from the book, but for the interest of time, let me just put it this way. The most important thing I've learned as a minister and as a counselor is that grief needs to be witnessed. That earlier quote, I talked about how people say, I can't find someone to understand me that I can relate to. And this is the silver lining of dealing with something as painful and difficult as grief. If a person can just listen and be present physically and emotionally and spiritually with someone, to let them share their pain, that's a huge step forward in the healing process. Okay. And the act of witnessing someone's vulnerability can bring the person out of isolation if the witnessing is done without judgment. Right? Now, I also work a lot with death and dying. I just did 6 weeks filling in as a hospice chaplain. And when people die, one of the common questions I get as a pastor, as a chaplain, is, what should I say? And the first thing I say is, have you considered nothing? Probably the best thing you can do is say nothing and just listen or give them a hug. Because what happens with a lot of grief issues and death is people want to fix it, and they get in and they say things like, oh, God was just ready to have someone in heaven, right? But the problem with these statements that we throw out there is there's also a second part of the statement that isn't being said. God wanted somebody in heaven, what? Because they weren't good enough down here, right? Or God knew that this was the right time for your loved one to pass away. So you're saying that this was the right time for me too? I don't feel ready for that. So I can't emphasize enough the power and the importance of just simply listening, non-judgmentally and loving people. A few things that you'll see when people are grieving. When people repeat their story of loss over and over and over again, do you know what that usually is a signal for? It's a signal that nobody's listening to them. And when I say not listening, I mean attending and listening, not just sitting there pretending they're listening. And then we see people that will compare a lot. Oh, it's hard taking care of Betty, but my neighbor has it a lot worse, right? That's a way of avoiding how painful it is that they're grieving the losses and the struggles of dealing with aging. And again, this idea of attending is so important. Giving someone your undivided attention and not having to say anything, reflecting back that you hear them and that you feel their pain. So I'm going to zip through here. Here's a few things tips for helping people to cope with loss. Listen, but don't judge and don't give advice. Okay. Allow people to grieve. It's not a problem to fix. See, a lot of people think that grieving is like a problem to fix. Like if someone has depression, you get therapy and you take an antidepressant. Grieving is not a problem to be fixed. It's a human experience that all human beings feel, and we have to just live through it. Preventing isolation. Now, if I had to pick the other most important thing that I'd want you to get out of the seminar today, it's this, preventing isolation. We use that term shut in. Sometimes I see churches talk about how many people were at the service or on Zoom. That's great. Why don't you calculate how many people were not there or who was not there? Are they isolating? Because isolation is extremely dangerous. It increases odds of depression, alcohol abuse, suicide. And many of the folks that become isolated as caregivers or that are struggling with age-related illnesses have a hard time picking the phone up and asking for help. And that's maybe where you at the church, if you can identify who those at-risk people are and come up with a way of connecting them, you can help prevent dangerous isolation. And then helping them associate with the right supportive people. What type of support do people need? Do they need someone just to come in and have a meal and fellowship with them? Do they need a caregiver that can give them some respite so that they can go out and get some shopping or get things done? Do they need to get to doctor's appointments that they haven't been getting to? Okay, that's another point. So, how are we doing on time here? Well, we're doing pretty good. Do we have any quick questions from anyone before I go into part 3, which is the caregiver burnout? Any questions so far?
How do you think you'd go about counting how many people are not there? Like, how would you start with that? Like,
Well, I think that would be a process that you'd have to do in a discussion with people in the church, especially older people in the church or people that have been in the congregation for a few years and can remember who's there, right? I mean, you know more about this than I do because I'm not a congregational minister, right?
yeah, that's why I was thinking, like, I don't know, I can't even think.
But
where
you're
to
basically
start.
talking about the older people, not just.
Yeah, we're talking about, well, actually, wait, too, older people and adult children that maybe aren't coming because they have responsibilities, caregiving, and can't get away on Sunday to come to church. And, or you might even just say, who's coming to Zoom that used to come in person? Because one thing I've learned, and I do a lot of work with support groups, a wide variety of support groups. Zoom is great because it's convenient, but it's not the same. Sorry for you guys watching. I got a few here in person. But there's something about being physically present with people, getting a hug, reading the body language. So that might be another one, maybe who are the people that you see on Zoom and, you know, why are they doing that instead of not coming? That could be another way.
I know in our church, we have, every member as well as the regular visitors are divided amongst the deacons. So I have like a set of people.
Oh,
And then I'm, like nurture to those people specifically. And we all help each other out, of course, but, so then like you kind of know that, a little better what's going on with people and their backstory. Of course, a lot of people you don't respond to you and you never know what's going on, but, and then you also have a point of contact. And then that try and, you know, I would try harder to visit those people like that are in long-term care, the ones that are assigned to me and, that sort of thing.
Were you talking about the entire congregation?
The
yeah.
entire congregation.
How
So
big
we
is your
only have-
congregation?
Hmm?
How big is your congregation?
I don't know. We're small, very small here at St. James. I don't have the number of, people, but we also have a,
I mean, that'd be a lot of people for us, even though we have a really teeny tiny congregation. There's 12 of us and we have over 200 people. That'd be a lot of people for each of
Well,
us.
how many people do you have on your list? No, she
oh,
probably has.
no, that would be yeah, we have, I think we have 6 deacons and we have, we have proportionate to the number. But, I don't know, maybe 40 people. I don't know. I'm just saying that off the top of my
You
head.
have 40 people on your list?
Probably, yeah. And,
Not really.
no, it's just, I mean, I'm not saying I visit these people every week. I'm saying they're just,
She's a contact person for them.
Well, what
and
if I
then some
went,
of them I've never even talked to, you know what I mean? They're like, you know, but I know that they've been, I know the story that they've been tried 3 times before, the deacon before me and never responded. Kind of know a little bit, you know, late their history, you know, so they're just not lost. You know, what happens is there's popular people at the church, of course, that everybody wants to visit. And then there's, you know what I mean? So it helps that people don't fall through the cracks, you know? There's people on my list that I do nothing with because I know they have like all these great friends, you know, that they
Oh, okay.
they connect with much better than me, but then there's,
Somebody who might not have somebody.
so,
well, we were on this metaphor of fishing today from the scripture, right? I'm a fly fisherman. Actually, I'm gonna go home and tie flies this afternoon. Okay? And I also hunt too. I do a lot of outdoor sport. And, when they fished in the Old Testament, they threw a net out, right? That, they were net fishermen, right? And in that scripture that we read today, you know, they weren't fishing in the right place. And Jesus told them where to fish. And so what I might suggest to congregations is maybe you need a little bit of fishing guidance from God and go into some discernment in your congregation. So where you're casting your nets, and maybe you need to go through all these people and figure out where the fishing is good. Maybe some people are just not interested, but what if I went to some of the people on that list and I said, well, why don't you go to that church anymore? And then they say, I don't know, nobody ever contacted me from there. I thought they didn't care. Because I'm a real big believer that one of the things we forget about when we look at Jesus' ministry, it was relational. He was connecting and relating to people. So many healing stories, touching and transforming lives. And I think that's where in congregations, deacons can have a really huge impact to reconnect those relationships. And some of it is sorting out. You know, scouting is a big part of fishing for me. You know, I'll fish in new water and kind of know where the holes are, where the fish are. And you may have rosters that are out of date and the people just, they're never going to come back, but there's got to be people in there somewhere that when you establish a relationship, there's a lot of potential to really do good ministry and to bring them back into the sheep's fold. So, well, let me keep moving here. All right. Any questions from the people that are on Zoom land there, out there in Zoom land? No? All right. Okay, let's look at pastoral perspectives and helping people with burnout and self-care. And here's some of the issues people are dealing with, trying to find the right doctor. One of the things that has come up in a lot of the support groups I speak at is there's a lot of ageism in medicine today. You go to a doctor over the age of 70, the doctor will say, oh, your age, whatever, blah, blah, blah. They wouldn't say that same thing to someone that was 50. And then if you're 80 or 90, it gets even worse. And a lot of people, with all of the changes in our medical system in the last 5 years, especially since the pandemic, a lot of people are struggling with getting hooked up with the right medical care and doctors, or people taking care of themselves. A lot of people don't even know what that means, right? Medication issues, right? I think one of the problems with older adults is I was at a Zoom meeting the other day, and we were talking about at our facilities, like the average number of pills a resident takes a day is 20 pills.
Yeah.
Right?
Mhm.
And then what we'll see with doctors is they will keep adding medications and they don't do med reviews, and before you know it, you're on 12 different meds, and that's an issue, okay, that we have to look at. And I'm talking about the caregivers here too. You could be a caregiver, they put you on an antidepressant, they put you on an anti-anxiety drug, they give you, the stat for cholesterol and blood, so medication's something that people need to look at. Family support. This is huge. One of the biggest areas of contention that I see in the Alzheimer's support groups that I go to is there's someone in the family taking care of the older family member, and the other people do not live nearby, and they have no idea how bad it is. And then whenever the person is asking for help, the family members will say, oh, I think you're overreacting. Dad's really not that bad. All you do is complain. So what I tell them is I have a cure for that. Tell them to come watch the loved one and go away for a weekend. And I guarantee by Monday they will understand. Okay. And then legal help. That's a big thing, right? Legal issues. How do you take care of, the wills and power of attorney, medical power of attorney, stuff like that. And then of course, church community and support. So these are all the different challenges here of that we see with caregiver burnout. Burnout is a holistic thing that affects that there's a term biopsychosocial, spiritual, right? Biologically, burnout does horrible things to your physical health. There's a list of issues there. Psychologically, we have all types of intrapsychic or individual problems that burnout creates, mainly depression, anxiety, and substance abuse can be a big sleeper in there too. And then socially, a lot of caregivers are burning out, and they become socially isolated because the care of the loved one is dominating their social life. I just spent a week in December, end of November down in Florida. I have an aunt who's 85 with Parkinson's. And my poor cousin, who's 52, had my aunt living with her at home with a hospital bed for 2 years. And so I went down there to help push things along and to get my aunt into a skilled care facility. Now, before we could get to that, she had to get a lawyer so that they could get everything arranged to have the assets in a position to qualify her for Medicare to get in there. So I went down for moral support. I cleaned her house. I did the yard. I cooked for them. And then I was there when they moved my aunt into a care facility. And that is very traumatizing for most people when you have to move a loved one into a nursing facility. She just texted me, and you can tell the way I do talks. I like to share personal stuff. So, I'm just not just a talking head, I'm dealing with it. So I got a text from her 2 days ago, and she said, this is brutal. Well, actually, she used another word. I can't use it in church event. She said, my mom her memory is getting worse. I'm getting like 20 texts a day. I had to turn my phone off. She's asking me when is she coming home? And I know I made the right decision, but it's brutal. I feel so guilty. Now, how did I support her? This is what you can do. I texted her. I tried to call her and she said, I don't want to talk. She was so upset. I said, I was there with you. We made the right decision. And even though it feels horrible, you did the right thing. And when I told them when I was down there, as I was caring for her until we moved in, I said, if we were a care facility, we would be shut down by the state for not meeting minimal care standards in our home. Think of that. Now, why do I bring that up? Because when we're looking at burnout, a lot of the burnout is people have trouble making decisions about how they're going to handle the situation. And you get so consumed by the caregiving that it's hard to pull back and see the bigger picture. And that's where someone like you guys and your churches can go in to be a companion, to hold hands, and to love someone and say, look, I'll be with you while you take the steps to take care of yourself and figure out what you're going to do. For most people, it's too overwhelming. Now, my grief support group that I did on Thursday, we did a whole group talking about hoarding and throwing things out after somebody dies, right? I can see people rolling their eyes here, right? And I asked the group, how did you finally deal with it? And they all came up with the same answer. I had to get somebody to help me. I couldn't do it all by myself. It was too overwhelming. And for some, it was getting like a caregiver to come in that could just physically go through the stuff, or another person. It was just someone being there saying, yeah, it's okay, throw that out. You don't need that. You're not going to need a comic book from 1937. It's probably not worth anything. Okay. So the thing about caregiving and burnout too, is people need cheerleaders. They need a cheerleader to encourage the caregiver to take care of themselves. Now, in my support groups that I speak at, the number one question that comes up is, why do I feel so guilty when I'm taking care of myself? And if you've been in that position, you know what I'm talking about. Why do you think that is? Why do you think people feel guilty?
Because why should they have fun if the person they're caring for can't?
Okay.
And usually the person being cared for is doing without something in order, it's a tough situation. So they.
Well, from a theological perspective, one thing and this is really clear in the book of Ecclesiastes, life isn't fair. Life isn't fair. Why does my aunt have Parkinson's? She didn't choose that, right? I look at my cousin, she's 52, still hasn't gotten married. She's struggling with her career. And we have to acknowledge sometimes that life isn't fair, and we're not in control, right? But on another level, it gets back to my first part of the talk. It's part of the grieving process, right? Because if you look at the Kubler-Ross stuff on loss and grief, it talks about bargaining, okay? And a lot of times when people are grieving changes or dealing with the loss, in this case, you're caregiving and you feel badly that your loved one isn't well, and then you want to go have a good time, that's actually related to grief that you're processing about how can they still be suffering and I'm enjoying my life. You're processing that weird balancing act, that it's not fair, and that, something to think about. Okay, let's keep moving here. So for you guys and anyone in the church, I think that you can play a really unique role in the community in supporting caregivers. If you get out and identify them, you're not social workers, you're not chaplains, you're not counselors, you're human beings who can show compassion, right? Crystal was talking about that. Who can encourage, who can love, who can say, I remember you, I noticed you weren't there, I miss you. You're gonna get through it, right? And this is a big one, pastoral authority. Now, I've had to wrestle with this because I went from being a therapist to being a minister, and I had to do clinical pastoral education. And at first, that's where you work in a hospital and they train you to be a chaplain, right? And I was like, oh, I don't need that. I'm already trained as a therapist. I don't need to deal with that. My Presbytery made me do it. It was the best thing they ever did. And what I learned about was pastoral authority. Okay, now what do I mean by pastoral authority? There are certain topics or issues that a psychologist, that a doctor, that a nurse, that a social worker, that another family member can't talk about with any type of authority. But when you go in as a church member or your pastor goes in and talks to people, you can talk about issues like end of life, suffering, all the things that we learn about in our Christian faith. You can talk about that from a faith perspective and give people a conversation that they feel is meaningful. Now, I've had very few doctors that I've had that we could sit down and talk about our faith. They're being a doctor, right? Or even therapists. Most therapists, some are faith-based, right? But as people in a faith community, you have the authority to speak openly about these issues, the elephants in the living room, the grief, the caregiving, and you're there as a member of the community faith who is loving and supporting, not as someone who's diagnosing or analyzing or setting up something legal for social services. You follow me? So there's a unique role that you can play that could be easily overlooked. It's quite powerful. Okay, many people, especially members of the older congregations, aren't comfortable talking with shrinks, counselors, psychologists, and that's been one of the most fun things about becoming a minister. I can talk to people about anything that they would not be caught dead talking about to a shrink. They wouldn't even go to a therapist or a counselor. Now, middle-aged and younger people, they're more acculturated, but for most older adults, they're just not comfortable talking to a therapist, but they will talk to a deacon or an elder or a pastor in the church because it's culturally acceptable from that culture and that time that they grew up in. Okay. And this is the other one that I think is really important, is you can maybe play a role facilitating communication with family members and members of the faith community who can be supportive. You can get in there, and if you get to know some of these people, you can know who they are, who their family members are. Maybe you can get creative and help them problem solve and come up with ways of how they can connect with people in their orbit who could provide more support to them. You know, maybe Fred is spending all his time taking care of Betty, but you know that Fred has two sons that live in the area and they never stop by. Now you don't want to get in trouble, but you might say, you know, Fred, I think it's okay for you to call your sons and say, you know, my blood pressure's up, I'm struggling, I need some help.
Right.
Because what I found with a lot of older adults is it isn't so much that they're refusing help as they're afraid to ask for help. And with your encouragement, you might be able to help them tap into some of those resources. Or maybe even if you know maybe if you know Fred's sons through church or something, you might say, hey, I was visiting your dad. He's really hanging in there, but you know, he's not getting any younger. Have you ever thought about trying to get over and give him a break every now? Right? It's a very delicate thing. You don't want to get in a triangle with family, you know, that could be. But that's just a thought, okay? And then for clergy and deacons, okay, back to the fundamentals, listening is the most important thing. Letting people feel heard. When you listen to someone, it means you value them. You care about them. And I don't know about you, but doesn't seem to me like there's a lot of really good listeners running around out there in this world that we live in. And a lot of people today, I think they have about a 2-minute attention span if you're lucky, because their brains have been so rewired with all the social media stuff. And again, back to encouraging people to get help, whether it's medical, support groups, paid caregivers can lighten the load. promoting better family communication, discussing living arrangements, or planning, long-term care planning, legal work, and then back to encouraging self-care. And I know when I got, and again, my cousin's a great example. She's only 52. She was living alone caring for my aunt. And when I got down there, I was horrified. She looked horrible. She actually teaches in an inner school with, pretty rough students. She'd lost weight. She was struggling with depression. And just after a week there of supporting her, she put a little weight back on. I fed her. She felt like she wasn't alone anymore. And it's still a journey. It's been about 10 weeks now, and she's coming around, but I have to regularly encourage her to eat well and to take care of herself, and also to make those outside social contacts, because she became very isolated with the caregiving. All right. So here's some faith-related topics that you can maybe bring up in discussions, talking about love and relationships with family. The challenges of dealing with a person aging and caregiving, talking about real things. Yeah, it's great Taylor Swift's going to be at the Super Bowl, but how's mom doing? Okay. Just like in that example from the scripture, Jesus had the campfire and he's grilling fish. It was very real and down to earth. And if I can have a criticism of some religious organizations and religious people, sometimes they're way up here into some very intellectual or theological issues, but people need to be met right down here in just the day-to-day challenges of living. Forgiveness and reconciliation is huge. There's a lot of people that are dealing with age-related illnesses and caregiving that feel like they've been betrayed, sidelined, ignored, and there's a lot of resentment in family systems when you're dealing with these things. And forgiveness is such a great topic that we can talk about as Christians in ministry, right? I know you're angry at your daughter because she never comes by, and you say you're never going to forgive her. But have you ever thought that if you don't forgive her and reconcile, that guarantees that she'll never come by again, right? Or you could talk to the daughter and say, I know it seems like your dad doesn't love you anymore. He's so angry that you're not meeting his expectations, but can you forgive him and love him anyway? And maybe after he sees how much you love him, it will melt his heart and you can have a more improved relationship. See, those are things that any of you can do. It doesn't have to be a pastor or someone in the church. Another one is death and belief in the afterlife. You'd be surprised how many people haven't really thought about what happens when you die, right? I don't know, maybe some of you haven't. I've worked with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people that have died. Okay, I've been doing this for a long time. And it's really funny to see where people end up when they believe something until they're on hospice and they know they only have a couple of weeks left. And then you get okay, look, I don't have much time left. Can you just get to the key points here? I'm getting a little worried. Right? And as people of faith, we have the hope of the resurrection. And for many Christians, I'll just say Presbyterians, so I can pick on our own crowd. I think for a lot of people, the resurrection is just an idea. I mean, the Apostle Paul says it pretty clearly. The way you can know if you're a real Christian is you believe in the resurrection. And it says, in the Apostles' Creed, the bodily resurrection. Have people really thought about what that means? This is your opportunity to talk about that. And for most people, what I've found is you don't have to correct them or educate them so much as to let them talk about what they've learned and what they believe. And as they process that, the Holy Spirit and your caring, loving presence will guide them to somewhere where they can find peace. Because at the end of life, there's only two questions. Where am I going? And what am I leaving behind? And we want to help people with those two questions. And that could be part of this process too. What's happening after this life is over? Help people so they're not worried about that. And what am I leaving behind? Are there damaged family relationships, unfinished business, things like that? Okay. Suffering. And as you know, the term theodicy is a theological term about understanding the mystery of how can a good God allow such horrible suffering. Okay, here's the quick answer. Nobody's agreed on an answer for 2,000 years and longer. But what we do know through Christ, through Jesus, is that we have a God who suffers with us. And if you can be with people in their suffering, listening to them, accompanying them, having a cup of tea with them, driving them somewhere when they need to pick up a medicine, you are sharing in their suffering by being there and not abandoning them. And then all the God issues. Gee, there's so many things. Everyone goes through a crisis of faith. Now, I used to have a few nuns that worked for me, and I did this topic one time, and this one sister, Michelle, she said, well, I never had a crisis of faith, like it was a sin. And I said, well, you know, Mother Teresa of Calcutta had a crisis of faith. It's quite well documented. But she said, oh, I think the media blew that up too much. Everyone has a crisis of faith at some point or another. And where your diaconate, your ministry and the church can be, is to be with people in that crisis and say, you know what? It's normal to have a crisis of faith. You're just upgrading to a more sophisticated version and working through the pain, and you will get there. There's nothing wrong with you. It happens to everyone. And sometimes it can be very painful and take time. So, how are we doing here? So when you're dealing with people with dementia, I'm getting down near the end here. Years ago, Pat Robertson, when he was around, had someone on the 700 Club who was having a relationship with a woman because his wife was in a secure dementia unit and didn't remember who he was anymore. And he asked Pat if that was okay. And Pat said, well, I think it's okay because Alzheimer's and dementia is actually a form of mental death, and it's like the person's dead. This is true. Documented. Isn't that horrible? Now, I know sometimes people do, you know, have friends and things when that happens, but their soul is not dead, Pat. Maybe the mind is not working. And these are my tips on dealing with people with dementia. One is remember the bigger picture. Maybe the person that's with you right now doesn't remember much or know anything, but remember the big picture. Remember their whole life. Remember that they have a spirit. Step back, the whole picture.
About 7 minutes, guys.
Yep, we're good. Differentiating the person from the illness.
7 minutes.
And is that it's really easy when someone is really declining and you're caregiving to just think that's the person. No, that's not. That's the person with an illness. The person who they really are is in those pictures on the bureau or the table or the family photo album and memories of what they used to do. That's the illness is not the person. Again, remembering the soul and the spirit. In the ancient world, they had this belief that we had a mind, the nous, the brain, right? We had the sarx, which was the physical body. Okay, well, actually that's flesh, the soma, which is the body. And then they had the pneuma, the spirit, right? We sometimes forget. I've done a lot of work with a lot of people with severe dementia. You would be shocked at the insights and the connections that people have that are really advanced in dementia, but you know there's got to be a soul or a spirit in there somewhere that's connecting. Reframing challenges as spiritual learning and growth opportunities, right? One of the greatest things that we'll be focusing on as we get to Passion Week and Easter is how Christ suffered, the way of the cross. And this is the cross that many people bear, and it's an opportunity for spiritual growth. And again, back to encouraging caregivers. All right, there's some resources here at the end that I have, and you can email Crystal for this information. And I also put a bibliography together, and you can feel free to contact me, Howard West. I'm in Country Meadows. And if you're interested and you want me to do a similar talk like this at your church, I'm open to that. I do that to help raise awareness with people in your church. I consider this my mission to minister to these forgotten people that are struggling and isolated due to age-related illnesses, and the army of caregivers that are caring for them every day that are quietly suffering and out of our awareness. Okay, so we're about ready to close up. Any final thoughts or comments? I hope this was helpful. We covered a lot of ground, you know.
I was just wondering from your perspective as a professional in a facility, has there been a change in the attitude or procedures or whatever of facilities towards the church and clergy and including them and involving them? I just had an unfortunate situation just yesterday, and I don't know whether it was unique to that facility or what, but that they
Yeah, so the
didn't
question
think of
is,
us as.
have some facilities had a change in attitude? A lot of the care facilities now are profit driven, they're owned by corporations. They have absolutely no program for spiritual care. Now, I'm with Country Meadows, the Leader family owns it, and chaplaincy and spiritual care is a really important piece for us.
Mhm.
But a lot of these places just don't get spirituality in churches, and they just don't get it. And I was at a conference a couple of years ago, and there was an executive from a company, and he said, if I ever bought your company, the first thing I would do is fire all the chaplains. What a waste of money.
Wow. Mm.
So that's part of the culture change. They're more
Right.
clinical, it's more medical model, and that's, yeah.
Mm.
But I would encourage you too to talk to local unit managers where a person is and say, hey, I'd like to visit the person. And if they're a person, chances are they're gonna get it and may be able to let you do a visit and.
Well, sure, but yeah, I mean, I can't, but I'm just shocked that like they didn't call when someone was dying, despite the fact that like 3-4 times a week, someone from our church had been in there, you know what I mean? And I
Yeah.
thought, where was their, I always thought they had a clergy on call or something, or would call us or something.
It's
And
pretty spotty. If they're on
You know?
hospice, it's a little better because hospice is required to have chaplains.
Yeah.
But I think I've also seen too, since the pandemic, communication in general is not what it used to be,
Mhm.
especially in the care professions. Any other comments?
Yeah, I have a
from the-
question. I
Yeah,
have a question about caregivers.
Yeah.
Aside from like at a facility, do you hear more stories about people who can't get help?
in the home?
Yes.
Yeah, it's
I have
becoming
3
increasing.
personal
Yeah.
story. I have a friend who literally called 60 agencies.
Yeah.
And can't get any help.
Yeah, there's a crisis now with caregivers and people working in elder care. The wages are not very good, and I hate to always blame the younger generation, but a lot of younger people are just not interested in caregiving for older adults.
Because we brought them up that they're the key.
Especially
It is one.
That's a whole nother thing, like-
consistently,
Yeah, any questions from the folks out in Zoom land? No? Well, I hope you've enjoyed this, and if you want me to come speak at your church, just let me know. I'd love to come. I'm always wanting to increase awareness and get people thinking about this tremendous opportunity for ministry here. Really good stuff, okay? All right, well, I think that's about it. I need to get off before they get out the shepherd's crook and pull me off the stage. Yeah, we have one final.
My sister has, within the past 8 months or so, gone into assisted living, and she's pretty much with it, but not quite. But I go to see her once a month, and I always ask her if she needs anything. And I asked her that one time a couple months ago. I said, well, can I bring you anything? Do you need anything? And she said, yeah. She said, freedom, independence.
Yeah.
And so you were right on when you said that. I mean,
Yeah,
she sort of knows that she needs the help and she knows why she's there, but she still misses it.
yeah. Well, that's why we see those silver alerts when we're out driving. People decide they're gonna be independent and they get in
They
the
take
car.
off.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, take care, everyone. It was a pleasure seeing you all. Have a blessed rest of the meeting today. And I'm gonna close.
No.
I thought it
There's a
Yeah, I
thing
know.
saying close all rooms. I don't. Should I
Do it
get
in
that?
there.
You do it there?
Thank you.
Yeah, I hope you got something out of that. It's,
An
dear
overwhelming
to my
topic,
heart.
isn't it? It's overwhelming,
it's a big
you know?
topic. And, I think congregations need to think about where you want to weigh in on this. It could be really fruitful, but it could also take up a lot of time and energy depending on what you want to do. Right? But I think we change the world one person at a time.
One step at a time.
One step at a time. Oh, here's,
Thank you, Howard. Appreciate
yeah,
it.
thank you, guys. Here's the recommended reading list that
Oh,
I got 2 grief books and some dementia books.
Thank you.
Thank you, a couple extras in it. Let's see if I later on some of our meetings.
So this is the Kessler book, Finding Meaning. He's good, and he has a good YouTube video summarizing the book. And this is a newer one I just got. It's okay that you're not okay. I love this one.
Mhm.
Yeah, the subtitle is Meeting Grief and Loss in a Culture That Doesn't Understand. And that's another good one. So what, now you're here at St. James, right? Where are your other churches?
First Press and Carlisle.
Carlisle,
Monaghan in
Montague,
Dillsburg.
Guilford,
Mhm.
And we're also both from First Press.
Okay.
from First
First
Pres. They
Presbytery.
got a big group here today, huh?
I've never, I've been a deacon for 4 years and I've never come to any of these before, so I thought I really better get here. But this is an interesting topic. I actually have three people,
It is
relatives or very close friends that are really seriously affected by this.
Yep.
And it's a big problem.
We started a grief group,
Is it good?
Mhm.
but people aren't coming to, well, one person is, but, so it's interesting, it's like,
They will when word gets out. I know a lot of people who have done those and every single person.
Yes.
kind of developed a
How much
certain
it helped
specific
them.
people that were very needy in mind, you know, like, cause they're horribly grieving, you know?
My mother went to one,
That's
my
hard.
gosh, my dad died in 1988 and she went to one at, Silver Springs Presbyterian and she wasn't a member of the church or really wasn't even from Mechanicsburg or anything. And she always said she made some good friends there and how much it helped her.
Yeah, my girlfriend was in one. Now, she doesn't, they just meet once a month for breakfast. You know what I mean? But
Right.
it's
So once a
developed a
month.
core group of friends that, went through the same
And
thing.
Eloise is going to one.
Yeah, well, I encourage.
You hang in there and get a core group that can take off, like the
Right.
one I started last year, the woman came in because her mom died, and then 2 weeks ago, her sister suddenly died, and the group just swooped in, and it's been a support, and they
Yeah.
developed a really deep relationship, so you just have to.
It is interesting, like, people who are such strong members and then their spouse dies, then the church becomes this painful place of
Yeah.
memory.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's
You know
what
what
I
I
feel
mean?
bad. That is a
And,
problem. We have a couple people like that who
Yes,
won't come.
and it's
Mhm.
horribly torturous, you know, and because they're, especially when they were like deeply involved, you know, like
Mhm.
it's what, so then none of that's fun because there's there are other parts not with them. It's not, you know,
Yeah.
and to try and find like
I always
new
think
things
of,
at the church to get involved in that don't
Linda.
remind them of.
Yeah, Linda Redberg, Karen Frazier.
Yep, they absolutely will not come back to
Yeah.
church.
So painful, you know?
Yeah, but I mean, like, I've reached
I think
out
we've tried and tried,
several times.
especially with Linda.
But,
Like, we have church members who live right next door to her.
yeah, you just
And,
can't.
and she communicates with them and everything, but she absolutely, she hasn't stepped foot in church since he died, I don't think. Maybe
That's
once,
sad.
maybe twice.
I also have heard of people who can't start support groups until like a year after the death of whoever
Yeah,
was
it's,
supposed
yeah,
to. They
the
just
time, yeah, it's
can't
individual.
do it.
Too much, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I have a friend who lost her husband very suddenly, I mean,
Mhm.
and so, and she did everything with her. They were married like 52
Yeah.
years, so she said, I just can't do that. I just can't do
Singing in
that.
the choir, all this stuff.
And I said,
Yeah.
well, like, one of the things is like going for things. I said, what, the first year is always the toughest. And she said, I can't go to family functions. And I said, cause she said, I just wanna cry. And I said, maybe you can go and just cry. It's okay.
Yeah, cry.
You know what I mean? I think if you let it out a little bit, you'll feel better.
Yeah, the 1 year myth is bad. Everyone's different, it takes time.
I have a 3-year man.
There's a 3 year myth.
Yeah, what you doing? Yeah, you can see your. Here. Down. You can see here.
I went.
I've been praying for you. Principal officer, how do you use that? I went to Pennsylvania, Florida.